Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change two lives forever. Sometimes what seems like a simple choice reveals the true measure of a man's character. In 1887, Ezekiel Harmon lived alone in the Wyoming mountains. At 52, he had grown used to the silence and solitude of his cabin. Most folks avoided these remote trails once winter came, but Ezekiel knew every path through the snow. When he found a small leather wallet buried in a snowbank, he could have kept it. The fine Eastern craftsmanship and the few dollars inside would have been useful. But inside was a calling card, Miss Victoria Ashford from Boston. Instead of keeping what he found, Ezekiel rode 2 days through a blizzard to send word about the lost wallet. He had no idea that simple choice would bring an elegant widow to his door weeks later. What would make a refined Boston lady travel all the way to a mountain man's cabin? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather wallet had been tucked away in Ezekiel Harmon's saddlebags for 3 weeks now, but he could still feel its weight whenever he rode down the mountain trail. Not its physical weight, the thing barely registered against the bulk of supplies and tools he carried, but something deeper. The weight of responsibility, perhaps. Or maybe it was the lingering scent of lavender that seemed to cling to the fine leather. A reminder of a world so far removed from his own that it might as well have existed on another planet. His cabin sat nestled against the granite face of Eagle Peak, positioned to catch the morning sun, but sheltered from the worst of the winter winds. Ezekiel had built it himself 12 years ago, when he'd first come to these mountains seeking something he couldn't quite name. Peace, maybe, or just the blessed absence of memories that seemed to follow him everywhere civilization touched. The structure was solid, built to last, thick pine logs chinked with clay and moss, a stone chimney that drew clean, and windows positioned to give him clear sightlines down the valley. Inside, the single large room served as kitchen, living area, and sleeping quarters, with a smaller adjoining space for storage and his workshop. Most visitors, if he'd ever had any, would have called it sparse. Ezekiel called it sufficient, but the cabin held secrets that spoke to depths beneath his rugged exterior. In one corner sat a chess set he'd carved during his second winter here, each piece shaped with meticulous care from different types of wood, oak for the light pieces, walnut for the dark. The board itself was a masterwork of inlay, with alternating squares of maple and cherry that caught the firelight in the evenings. It was the kind of work that spoke of education, patience, and an artistic sensibility that seemed at odds with the rough mountain man who lived here. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books that would have surprised anyone who knew Ezekiel only by reputation. Shakespeare and Byron sat alongside practical volumes on animal husbandry and metallurgy. There were books on philosophy, history, and natural science, all well worn from countless readings during the long winter nights. A battered copy of Walt Whitman's poetry collection lay open on the small table beside his chair, marked with careful annotations in the margins. These were the remnants of the man he'd been before the war changed him, before he'd watched his entire unit die in a hellish charge at Antietam that should never have been ordered, before he'd carried the guilt of surviving when better men than him had fallen. The books were all he'd kept from his former life as a schoolteacher in Ohio, back when he'd believed in the nobility of learning and the power of words to change the world. Every morning, Ezekiel followed the same ritual. He rose before dawn, built up the fire, and put coffee on to boil. The coffee was strong and black, made from beans he purchased on his weekly trips to Old Pete's trading post, 15 miles down the mountain. While it brewed, he would step outside to check on his animals. A sturdy mountain horse named Buck, 2 milk goats, and a handful of chickens that somehow managed to thrive in this harsh environment. The goats provided milk and cheese. The chickens gave him eggs, and his extensive vegetable garden, carefully tended and protected from wildlife by a fence he'd built himself, supplied potatoes, onions, beans, and hardy greens that could survive the mountain climate. He hunted for meat when needed, setting snares for rabbits and occasionally bringing down a deer or elk. It was a self-sufficient life, one that asked nothing from the world and expected even less in return. But it was also a lonely life, though Ezekiel rarely allowed himself to acknowledge that fact. He'd chosen solitude deliberately, believing it was what he deserved after the war. The guilt he carried wasn't the kind that could be absolved through confession or forgiveness. It was bone deep, part of who he was now. He'd made his peace with it, or so he told himself. His only regular human contact came through his weekly visits to Old Pete's trading post. Pete Morrison, though everyone just called him Old Pete, had been running the post for over 20 years, serving the scattered miners, trappers, and homesteaders who eked out livings in this remote corner of Wyoming territory. Pete was pushing 70, with a white beard that reached nearly to his belt, and eyes that had seen enough of life to judge no man harshly. The trading post was more than just a store. It served as post office, bank, saloon, and social center for the few hardy souls who called this wilderness home. Pete knew everyone's business without being nosy about it, and he had a gift for knowing when a man needed conversation and when he needed to be left alone. With Ezekiel, he'd learned to gauge the mountain man's mood carefully. "Afternoon, Ezekiel," Pete would say when the tall, bearded figure ducked through the doorway of the low-built trading post. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." Ezekiel would nod his thanks and accept the tin cup gratefully. The coffee at the trading post was somehow always better than what he made at home, though Pete swore he used the same beans and the same method. Maybe it was the company that made the difference, though neither man would have admitted as much. Their conversations were sparse, but meaningful. Pete would share news from the outside world, who was coming and going, what the weather looked like for the next few days, any messages that might have come through the twice-monthly mail delivery. Ezekiel would settle his accounts, purchase whatever supplies he needed, and sometimes linger over that second cup of coffee, listening to Pete's stories about the old days when this country was even wilder than it was now. "You ever think about taking a wife, Ezekiel?" Pete had asked once, during a particularly long winter when the isolation seemed to be weighing heavier than usual on his customers. Shoulders Ezekiel had looked up from his coffee with something between surprise and pain flickering across his weathered features. "That life ain't for me, Pete. Some men are meant for solitude. Some men think they are," Pete had replied carefully. "Don't mean they're right about it." It was the closest either of them had ever come to discussing Ezekiel's past, though Pete had heard enough stories over the years to piece together the general outline. Most folks in these parts had reasons for seeking isolation, and Pete had learned long ago not to pry too deeply into wounds that might still be bleeding. The truth was that Ezekiel had loved once, before the war. Her name had been Sarah, and she'd been the minister's daughter in the Ohio town where he taught school. They'd planned to marry in the spring of 1863, after he returned from what everyone thought would be a brief stint in the Union Army. But Sarah couldn't marry a ghost, and that's what had come back from the war, a hollow man wearing Ezekiel's face, carrying guilt too heavy for any woman to share. He'd released her from their engagement without explanation, taken his few possessions and headed west. He'd been running from those memories for 12 years now, and the mountains had been the only place where the weight of them seemed bearable. But lately, something had been stirring in the depths of his carefully maintained solitude. Maybe it was the approaching spring, or maybe it was simply the natural human need for connection asserting itself after years of suppression. The leather wallet in his saddlebag seemed to symbolize something, a bridge between his isolated world and the larger life he'd left behind. When he'd found it half buried in the snow near the old mining trail, his first instinct had been to check for identification. The calling card inside had been printed on fine paper with elegant script. Miss Victoria Ashford, 247 Beacon Street, Boston, Massachusetts. There'd also been a small photograph, a formal portrait of a woman in her 30s with intelligent eyes and a reserved expression. She was beautiful, certainly, but it was something in her eyes that had caught his attention. A sadness, perhaps, or a longing for something beyond the confines of the photographer's studio. The wallet had contained $12, more money than Ezekiel usually saw in a month, along with a few receipts from Boston shops and what appeared to be a train ticket stub dated several weeks earlier. Everything about it spoke of wealth and refinement, of a world where people hired carriages instead of walking and bought books new instead of second-hand. A lesser man might have kept it. The money alone would have made his life considerably easier, and who would have known? The chances of Miss Victoria Ashford ever making her way to this remote corner of Wyoming were virtually non-existent. But keeping it had never been an option for Ezekiel, not even for a moment. His father had raised him to believe that a man's character was measured not by what he did when others were watching, but by what he did when he was alone with his conscience. So he'd made the 2-day journey through a late-season blizzard to reach the nearest telegraph station, a dangerous trip that had nearly cost him his life when Buck had stumbled on an ice-covered rock slide. But he'd made it, sent his message to the address on the calling card, and returned to his mountain sanctuary with the quiet satisfaction that came from doing the right thing. That had been 3 weeks ago, and he'd heard nothing since. He assumed Miss Ashford had received his telegram and simply written off the loss as the price of whatever adventure had brought her to the Wyoming territory in the first place. Wealthy Eastern ladies weren't known for venturing into dangerous territory to retrieve lost items from mountain hermits. As he sat by his fire that evening, working on a new piece for his chess set, a replacement knight that had been damaged when he'd dropped the board the previous winter, Ezekiel found his thoughts returning to the photograph in the wallet. There had been something haunting about the woman's expression, something that spoke to the loneliness he carried in his own heart. It was foolish, of course. He knew nothing about her beyond what the wallet's contents revealed, and she belonged to a world that might as well have existed in the pages of one of his books, for all the connection it had to his reality. But as the wind howled around the cabin and the fire settled into glowing coals, Ezekiel Harmon allowed himself to wonder what kind of woman would venture so far from home, and what might have driven her to lose her wallet on a remote mountain trail in the middle of a Wyoming winter. The morning brought an answer that Ezekiel never expected to receive. He was splitting firewood behind his cabin when he heard the distant sound of wheels on the rocky trail below. The sound was wrong for this time of year, too early for the supply wagons that occasionally made their way up to the higher claims, and too rhythmic for the irregular clatter of a prospector's pack mule. This sounded like a proper wagon, maybe even a stagecoach, which made no sense at all on a trail that led nowhere but to his cabin and the abandoned silver mine beyond it. Ezekiel set down his axe and walked to the edge of his property, where the land dropped away in a series of rocky terraces toward the main valley below. Through the pine trees, he could make out movement on the switchback trail that led up from Old Pete's trading post. It was indeed a stagecoach, though what it was doing on this remote track was beyond his understanding. He watched its slow progress up the mountain, noting the care with which the driver navigated the treacherous turns and the way the horses labored in the thin air. Whoever was inside that coach was either lost or very determined to reach his particular corner of the wilderness. Given that his cabin was the only destination the trail served, Ezekiel began to suspect he was about to receive an unexpected visitor. 20 minutes later, the stagecoach pulled into the small clearing in front of his cabin. The driver, a weathered man named Jake, who occasionally worked routes through the territory, looked as puzzled as Ezekiel felt. Jake tipped his hat in greeting, but his expression suggested he thought this whole enterprise was probably a mistake. "Got a passenger for you, Mr. Harmon," Jake called down from his perch. "Lady says she's expected." The door of the stagecoach opened, and Ezekiel felt his world shift on its axis. The woman who stepped down was unmistakably the same one from the photograph in the wallet, though seeing her in person revealed details the formal portrait had never captured. She was taller than he'd expected, with auburn hair pinned back in a style that spoke of careful attention even after what must have been an uncomfortable journey. Her traveling dress was practical, but obviously expensive, made from fine wool in a deep blue that complemented her complexion. But it was her eyes that stopped him. The same intelligent, searching gaze from the photograph now fixed directly on him with an intensity that made him suddenly aware of his rough appearance. "Mr. Harmon?" Her voice carried the cultured accent of educated Boston society, but there was strength in it too, a determination that had carried her through whatever ordeal had brought her to his remote cabin. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Ezekiel found his voice after a moment of stunned silence. "Miss Ashford." He touched the brim of his hat awkwardly. "I sent word about your wallet." "Didn't expect, that is, I never thought you'd come yourself." The telegram was quite clear about the location, she replied, though her gaze was taking in the crude cabin, the rough-hewn fence, and the various signs of his solitary existence. If she was shocked by the primitive conditions, she hid it well. "I must say it's rather more remote than I anticipated." Jake cleared his throat from the driver's seat. "Ma'am, if you want me to wait, I can take you back down to Pete's place tonight. Trail's going to be treacherous after dark. And there's weather coming in." Victoria, for Ezekiel found he could no longer think of her as Miss Ashford after seeing her standing in his dooryard, looked between Jake and Ezekiel with an expression that suggested she was weighing options he couldn't begin to guess at. "Actually," she said after a long moment, "I believe I'll be staying the night. The journey has been quite exhausting, and I'd prefer to rest before attempting the return trip." Jake's eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. "Ma'am, with respect, this ain't exactly— I mean, Mr. Harmon here's a decent fellow, but—" "I'm sure Mr. Harmon is a perfect gentleman," Victoria interrupted firmly. "After all, he went to considerable trouble to return my property rather than simply keeping it. That speaks to his character, doesn't it?" Ezekiel felt heat rising in his cheeks at the praise, though he wasn't sure why a simple acknowledgement of basic honesty should affect him so strongly. "I've got your wallet inside," he managed. "Let me fetch it for you." But Victoria was already instructing Jake to unload her traveling bag from the coach's roof. The driver looked as if he wanted to protest further, but something in her manner discouraged argument. He handed down a leather valise and accepted his fare with obvious reluctance. "I'll be back through tomorrow afternoon," Jake said, directing his words to Ezekiel rather than Victoria. "If the lady wants passage down the mountain—" "Thank you, Jake," Ezekiel said firmly. "We'll manage fine." After the stagecoach had disappeared back down the trail, leaving behind only the sound of wind through the pines and the distant call of a hawk, Ezekiel found himself alone with a woman for the first time in 12 years. The silence stretched between them, filled with questions neither seemed ready to ask. "Your wallet's inside," he said finally, gesturing toward the cabin door. "Everything's just as I found it." Victoria nodded and followed him into the cabin, her eyes taking in every detail of his simple home. He watched her expression carefully, trying to gauge her reaction to the rough furniture, the single room that served all purposes, the obvious signs of a man living alone. But her face remained carefully composed, revealing nothing of what she might be thinking. Ezekiel retrieved the wallet from the wooden box where he kept his few important papers. As he handed it to her, their fingers brushed briefly, and he was surprised by the warmth of her skin, despite the cool mountain air. "Everything appears to be here," Victoria said after checking the contents, "including the money." "That's quite remarkable, Mr. Harmon. Most people wouldn't have been so scrupulous." "Most people weren't raised by my father," Ezekiel replied. "He had strong opinions about taking what wasn't yours." Victoria smiled at that, the first genuine expression of warmth he'd seen from her. It transformed her face completely, revealing glimpses of humor and humanity beneath the careful composure. "He sounds like a wise man. I'd like to hear more about him if you don't mind." The request surprised him. In his limited experience with people of her social class, they rarely showed interest in the backgrounds of those they considered beneath them. But there was nothing condescending in her manner, only genuine curiosity. Perhaps over supper, he found himself saying. "It's not much, just venison stew and cornbread, but you're welcome to share it." "That sounds wonderful," Victoria said, and he could tell she meant it. "It's been quite some time since I've had a proper home-cooked meal." As Ezekiel busied himself preparing their simple meal, he found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guest. She had removed her traveling cloak and was examining his chess set with obvious appreciation, her fingers tracing the carved pieces with delicate care. "This is beautiful work," she said. "Did you carve these yourself?" "Keeps my hands busy during the long winters," Ezekiel replied, stirring the stew. "Do you play?" "I used to," Victoria said softly. "My late husband enjoyed the game. I haven't played since he passed." The mention of her widowhood hung in the air between them, and Ezekiel found himself wanting to know more about the circumstances that had brought her to his mountain. But he sensed that pushing too hard too soon would only cause her to retreat behind the walls of propriety she clearly knew how to construct. Instead, he focused on the meal, serving her a portion of stew in his best bowl, though best was a relative term in his simple household, and cutting thick slices of the cornbread he'd baked that morning. They ate by the light of the fire and a single oil lamp, the simple food somehow made special by the presence of company. "Mr. Harmon," Victoria said after they'd finished eating, "may I ask what brought you to this remote place? You're clearly an educated man. I can see the books, the quality of your woodwork. This seems an unusual choice for someone with your evident capabilities." It was the question he'd been dreading and expecting in equal measure. How could he explain the weight of guilt that had driven him to seek isolation without revealing the full extent of his demons? How could he make her understand that some men were simply meant to live apart from the world? "Sometimes a man needs to find peace away from the complications of civilization," he said carefully. "The mountains don't judge, and they ask nothing but respect." Victoria studied his face in the flickering firelight, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see more than he was willing to reveal. But she simply nodded, as if his answer satisfied her curiosity for now. "And what brings you to Wyoming territory, Miss Ashford?" he asked, turning the conversation away from dangerous ground. "It's a long way from Boston." For the first time since her arrival, Victoria's composure seemed to crack slightly. Her hands tightened around her cup of coffee, and her gaze dropped to the fire. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "a woman needs to find her own peace as well." The evening that followed was unlike any Ezekiel had experienced in his 12 years of mountain solitude. Victoria proved to be an engaging conversationalist, drawing him out on subjects he hadn't discussed with another soul in years. She asked thoughtful questions about his life in the mountains, the challenges of self-sufficiency, and the books that lined his shelves. Her genuine interest surprised him. Most people from her world, he assumed, would view his lifestyle as little more than an eccentric form of poverty. When it came time to arrange sleeping accommodations, Ezekiel found himself faced with a delicate problem he'd never had to consider. His cabin had been built for one person, with a single bed tucked into an alcove near the fireplace. He'd spent the better part of the evening trying to devise a solution that would preserve Victoria's modesty while not forcing him to sleep outside in the cold. "I can make a bed on the floor near the fire," he offered awkwardly. "You can have the proper bed. It's not fancy, but the mattress is good cornhusk and the blankets are warm." Victoria looked around the small space with practical eyes. "Mr. Harmon, this is your home, and I'm the unexpected guest. I wouldn't dream of displacing you from your own bed. If you have spare blankets, I'll be perfectly comfortable on the floor." "Absolutely not," Ezekiel said firmly. "My mother didn't raise me to let a lady sleep on the ground while I took comfort." The gentle argument continued for several minutes, until Victoria finally accepted his offer with gracious reluctance. Ezekiel arranged his bedroll near the fireplace, where he could tend the fire during the night and maintain a respectful distance from his guest. As he settled into the unfamiliar arrangement, he was acutely aware of Victoria's presence in his space, the soft rustle of fabric as she prepared for sleep, the subtle scent of lavender that seemed to follow her. Sleep came slowly, Ezekiel lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside and the gentle sounds of Victoria's breathing. It had been so long since he'd shared space with another person that every small sound seemed magnified. But there was something comforting about it, too, a reminder of what it felt like to not be completely alone in the world. Morning brought fresh awkwardness as they navigated the realities of sharing close quarters. Ezekiel rose early, as was his habit, and built up the fire before stepping outside to tend his animals and give Victoria privacy to dress. When he returned with fresh eggs and milk from the goats, he found her examining the small locket she wore around her neck, a delicate gold piece that she quickly tucked back beneath her collar when she noticed his return. "I hope you don't mind eggs for breakfast," Ezekiel said, setting the basket on the rough wooden table. "The chickens are good layers, even this time of year." "Eggs sound wonderful," Victoria replied, though he noticed a slight hesitation in her voice. "I must confess I'm not entirely sure what I expected to find when I came here, but this—" She gestured around the cabin. "It's quite different from what I imagined." "Different how?" Ezekiel asked as he began preparing their meal. Victoria was quiet for a moment, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I suppose I expected something more primitive, rougher, but you've created something that feels like a real home here, not just a shelter." The observation pleased him more than it should have. He'd taken pride in his small domestic achievements over the years, the well-fitted joints in his furniture, the efficient layout of his kitchen area, the way he'd positioned the windows to catch the best light for reading. But he'd never had anyone to appreciate these details before. "A man needs more than just survival," he said. "Even out here. Especially out here, I'd think," Victoria replied. "It would be easy to let civilization slip away entirely, wouldn't it? To forget what separates us from the animals." As they shared breakfast, Victoria began to reveal glimpses of her own story. She spoke carefully at first, but gradually with more openness about her life in Boston, her late husband, and the suffocating expectations of society life. Ezekiel found himself drawn into her world through her descriptions, the elaborate social rituals, the careful management of appearances, the way genuine feeling was often considered inappropriate or inconvenient. "My husband was a good man," she said, her fingers unconsciously moving to the locket at her throat. "Devoted to his business, respected in the community, but he was also controlled. Everything had to be managed, planned, executed according to his vision of how things should be." "That sounds lonely," Ezekiel observed quietly. Victoria looked up from her coffee with surprise, as if no one had ever made that particular connection before. "Yes," she said simply. "It was very lonely." The conversation was interrupted by a sound outside, the approach of a horse and rider. Ezekiel rose quickly, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle that hung above the door. Visitors were rare, and in his experience, people who rode alone to remote cabins usually brought trouble of one kind or another. But the voice that called out was familiar. "Ezekiel! You in there?" It was old Pete, probably wondering what had become of the fancy Eastern lady who'd hired Jake's stagecoach to venture up the mountain. Ezekiel opened the door to find the old trader sitting his horse in the clearing, his weathered face creased with concern. "Morning, Pete," Ezekiel said. "What brings you up this way?" "Jake told me about your visitor," Pete replied, his eyes moving past Ezekiel to where Victoria had appeared in the doorway. "Wanted to make sure everything was, well, that everything was proper." Victoria stepped forward with a smile that managed to be both gracious and slightly amused. "Mr. Morrison, I presume? I'm Victoria Ashford. Mr. Harmon has been the perfect gentleman, I assure you." Pete touched his hat respectfully. "Ma'am, not that I doubted Ezekiel's character, you understand. Just that, well, this country can be hard on folks who aren't used to it." "I'm finding it quite educational," Victoria replied. "In fact, I was hoping to extend my stay for a few more days, if Mr. Harmon doesn't object. The mountain air is quite restorative." Both men looked at her with surprise. Ezekiel felt his pulse quicken at the thought of her staying longer, though he wasn't sure if the feeling was excitement or anxiety. Pete's expression suggested he thought the whole idea was probably unwise, but wasn't sure how to voice his concerns politely. "Miss Ashford," Pete said carefully, "begging your pardon, but this ain't exactly Boston. Folks around here, well, they might talk about a lady staying alone with a bachelor man, even one as decent as Ezekiel." Victoria's chin lifted slightly, and Ezekiel caught a glimpse of the steel beneath her refined exterior. "Mr. Morrison, I'm a widow of 34 years. I believe I'm old enough to make my own decisions about where I stay and with whom. As for what people might say, well, I've discovered that people will talk, regardless of what one does. One might as well give them something interesting to discuss." Pete looked between them, clearly recognizing that he was in the presence of a will stronger than his own. "Well then," he said finally, "I suppose that's settled. Ezekiel, you need anything from the post?" "We're fine, Pete," Ezekiel replied. "But thank you for checking." After Pete had departed, shaking his head and muttering under his breath about the strange ways of Eastern folk, Victoria and Ezekiel found themselves alone again. The morning sun was streaming through the windows, and the cabin felt different somehow, more alive, more purposeful. "I hope you don't mind my presumption," Victoria said. "About staying longer, I mean. The truth is, I'm not quite ready to return to the life I left behind." "What kind of life was it?" Ezekiel asked gently. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on something beyond the window. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "The kind where you wake up each morning knowing exactly how the day will unfold, exactly what's expected of you, exactly how you're supposed to feel about it all. The kind where spontaneity is suspect and genuine emotion is inconvenient." She looked at him then, and he was struck by the vulnerability in her eyes. "I've felt more alive in the past 18 hours than I have in years." The days that followed took on a rhythm that felt both natural and extraordinary. Victoria proved surprisingly adaptable to the simple routines of mountain life, though Ezekiel could see her fighting against a lifetime of being waited upon. She insisted on helping with meals and daily chores, despite his protests that she was a guest and shouldn't concern herself with such matters. "Mr. Harmon," she said with gentle firmness on the third morning, "if I'm to stay here, I refuse to be treated like some delicate ornament. I may not know much about mountain living, but I can certainly learn." It was while she was exploring the cabin during one of Ezekiel's hunting trips that Victoria made a discovery that would change the careful distance they'd maintained between them. In a wooden trunk tucked beneath his bed, beneath layers of spare blankets and winter clothing, she found a small collection of items that spoke to a past he'd never mentioned. There were letters tied with faded ribbon, written in a feminine hand and addressed to "My dearest Ezekiel," a daguerreotype of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. And wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, a medal, the Congressional Medal of Honor, awarded for conspicuous gallantry at the Battle of Antietam, when Ezekiel returned that afternoon with a brace of rabbits for their supper. He found Victoria sitting at his table with the medal in her hands. Her expression was thoughtful rather than accusatory, but he felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble at the sight of his hidden past exposed to the light. "I'm sorry," Victoria said immediately, seeing his stricken expression. "I was looking for extra blankets, and I didn't mean to pry into your private things." Ezekiel stood frozen in the doorway, the rabbits forgotten in his hands. The medal seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window, a tangible reminder of the man he'd been before the war broke him. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said quietly. "But I have seen it," Victoria replied gently. "And now I understand why a man with your evident intelligence and education chooses to live in isolation. You're not running from civilization, Mr. Harmon. You're running from yourself." The observation hit him like a physical blow. For 12 years, he'd told himself that his solitude was a choice, a preference for the honest simplicity of mountain life over the complications of society. But Victoria's words stripped away that comfortable fiction, revealing the truth beneath. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. But the words lacked conviction. Victoria stood and approached him slowly, the medal still cradled in her palm. "This says you saved the lives of your fellow soldiers under enemy fire, that you carried wounded men to safety when any sane person would have sought cover. What happened to that man, Ezekiel?" The sound of his Christian name on her lips broke something loose inside him. He'd been Mr. Harmon to everyone for so long that hearing her speak his given name felt like a key turning in a lock he'd thought was permanently sealed. "That man got his entire unit killed," Ezekiel said roughly. "That man survived when better men didn't. That man came home to a woman who deserved better than a hollow shell wearing his face." Victoria set the medal carefully on the table and moved closer, her eyes never leaving his face. "What was her name?" "The woman in the photograph? Sarah." The name came out like a confession. "We were to be married when I returned from the war. She waited 2 years, God help her. But I couldn't. I wasn't the same man who'd left. Did you give her the choice? Did you let her decide whether she could love the man you'd become?" Ezekiel turned away, unable to bear the compassion in her eyes. She deserved someone whole, someone who could give her the life she'd dreamed of. "And what did you deserve?" Victoria asked softly. The question hung in the air between them, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Ezekiel had never considered what he might deserve beyond punishment for the crime of surviving. He'd built his entire life around the assumption that isolation was his proper penance. Victoria moved to the trunk and carefully gathered the letters and photograph, handling them with the reverence due to sacred things. "May I ask what happened to her?" "She married the banker's son 2 years after I left," Ezekiel said. "Had 4 children, by all accounts. Pete gets news sometimes, through folks who pass through from back east. She had a good life, and you've spent 12 years convincing yourself that was because you stayed away. It wasn't a question, and Ezekiel found he had no answer for it." Victoria returned the items to the trunk with careful precision, then sat back down at the table. The medal remained where she'd placed it, catching the light like an accusation. "May I tell you something about my own marriage?" Victoria asked. "About the choice I made to stay with a man who controlled every aspect of my life." Ezekiel nodded, settling into the chair across from her. "I told myself it was duty," Victoria continued, "that a good wife accepts her husband's guidance, that my feelings were less important than social stability. But the truth was, I was afraid of what people would think if I left, afraid of what would become of me without his protection. So I stayed, and I convinced myself it was virtue." She paused, her fingers tracing the worn wood of the table. "But it wasn't virtue, Ezekiel. It was cowardice. And every day I stayed was a day I robbed both of us of the chance to find something real." "That's different," Ezekiel protested. "You weren't responsible for—" "Wasn't I?" Victoria interrupted. "Wasn't I responsible for my own happiness? For his chance to find someone who could love him completely instead of enduring him dutifully?" She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "We make choices, Ezekiel. Sometimes we tell ourselves we're protecting others, but we're really protecting ourselves from the risk of being hurt again." That evening, they sat by the fire in a silence that felt different from the comfortable quiet of previous nights. The medal remained on the table between them, a bridge across the careful distance they'd maintained. Finally, Victoria spoke. "The locket I wear," she said, her hand moving to her throat. "It contains my husband's photograph. I've worn it every day since his funeral, like a chain binding me to a life I never truly chose." Ezekiel watched as she lifted the delicate gold piece over her head and held it in her palm. For a moment she stared at it with an expression he couldn't read. Then, with deliberate care, she opened it to reveal the serious face of a middle-aged man with stern eyes and an uncompromising mouth. "He was a good man," she said again, as if repetition could make it more true. "But he was never my choice. Our marriage was arranged by our families, a merger of appropriate bloodlines and compatible fortunes. I was 19 and too frightened to object." She closed the locket with a soft click and set it beside the medal on the table. "I've been carrying his memory like a burden I thought I deserved to bear. But perhaps some burdens are meant to be set down. Outside, the wind picked up, sending pine branches scratching against the cabin walls. Inside, two damaged souls sat in the firelight, beginning to understand that healing might be possible after all. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a young rider who looked nervous about venturing so far up the mountain trail. Ezekiel accepted the envelope with growing dread as he recognized the expensive paper and formal script that marked it as correspondence. From Victoria's world, a world that seemed increasingly intent on reclaiming her, Victoria read the letter in silence, her face growing pale as she absorbed its contents. When she finished, she folded it carefully and placed it on the table beside the medal and locket that had become fixtures there, symbols of the pasts they were both learning to confront. "My brother Charles," she said quietly. "He's become quite concerned about my extended absence from Boston society." Ezekiel felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd known this moment would come eventually. The demands of her real life would inevitably intrude on the fragile peace they'd built together. But knowing hadn't made him any more prepared for the reality. "What does he want?" Ezekiel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Victoria's laugh was bitter. "He wants me to remember my obligations, my position in society, the proper behavior expected of a widow of my standing." She picked up the letter again, scanning its contents. "He's particularly concerned about the gossip that's apparently begun circulating about my unconventional journey west. It seems my traveling alone, without proper chaperonage, has provided the matrons of Boston with considerable entertainment. And," Ezekiel prompted, sensing there was more, "and he's threatening to invoke the provisions of my husband's will if I don't return immediately. Apparently, there are clauses about maintaining proper moral character and upholding the family reputation. Charles believes my current behavior could be construed as, how did he put it, conduct unbecoming a woman of my station." The threat hit Ezekiel like a physical blow, though he tried not to let his reaction show. He'd always known that Victoria's presence in his cabin represented a temporary escape from her real life. But hearing the mechanisms of her golden cage described so explicitly made him realize how powerless he was against the forces arrayed against them. "What would that mean?" he asked. "If he invoked those provisions?" Victoria set down the letter with hands that trembled slightly. "It would mean losing everything. My inheritance, my independence, even my widow's portion. I would become entirely dependent on Charles's charity, and he would ensure that I never had the opportunity to embarrass the family name again." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of the ultimatum settling between them like a stone. Ezekiel found himself calculating distances and travel times, wondering how long they had before Charles Ashford's patience ran out entirely. "I should go," Victoria said finally. "I should return to Boston and make my peace with the life I was born to. It was foolish of me to think—" She stopped herself, but Ezekiel could hear the unfinished thought hanging in the air. "What was foolish?" he asked gently. Victoria looked at him with eyes that held both sadness and something that might have been love. "To think that I could choose my own path. To think that someone like me could find happiness with someone like you." The words hung between them, an admission of feelings neither had dared to voice directly. Ezekiel felt his heart racing as he processed what she'd said, not just the confession of affection, but the assumption that such feelings were doomed by the circumstances of their birth. "Victoria," he said, using her given name for the first time, "what do you want? Not what Charles wants, not what society expects, but what you want." She was quiet for so long that he began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I want to stay. I want to learn to milk the goats and tend the garden and read by the fire in the evenings. I want to wake up each morning not knowing exactly how the day will unfold." She paused, meeting his eyes directly. "I want to see if what I think I feel for you is real, or just the intoxication of feeling free for the first time in my life." Ezekiel felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of bonds he'd thought were permanent. "And what do you think you feel?" Victoria stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the mountains that had become the backdrop to their unlikely courtship. "I think I'm falling in love with a man who carved chess pieces to keep his hands busy and who risked his life in a blizzard to return a stranger's lost property. I think I'm falling in love with someone who sees beyond the surface of things to what really matters." The confession hung in the air between them, beautiful and terrible in its honesty. Ezekiel rose and moved to stand behind her, close enough to catch the scent of lavender that had become so familiar. "Victoria," he said softly, "I haven't been fair to you. I've let you stay here, let myself grow attached to your presence, without being honest about what that means." She turned to face him, and he could see the fear in her eyes, fear of what he might say, fear of having her hopes crushed before they'd fully formed. "I'm not the same man who won that medal," he continued. "The war changed me in ways that can't be undone. I have nightmares that wake me screaming. I have days when the weight of memory makes it hard to get out of bed. I chose this life of isolation because I believed it was what I deserved, but also because I couldn't bear the thought of burdening someone else with my demons." Victoria reached up and touched his face with gentle fingers, tracing the lines that years of guilt and loneliness had carved there. "And I'm not the same woman who married Howard Ashford at 19 because her parents told her it was her duty. We're both different people than we were, Ezekiel. The question is whether we can be different together." Before he could respond, she rose on her toes and kissed him, a soft, tentative touch that sent shockwaves through his entire being. It had been so long since he'd felt the warmth of another person's lips against his own that he'd almost forgotten what it meant to be wanted, to be chosen. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Ezekiel rested his forehead against hers. "If you stay," he said quietly, "it won't be easy. Charles will fight us. Society will condemn us. And I can't promise that I'll be easy to live with." Victoria smiled, and in that expression he saw not the refined Boston widow, but the woman she was becoming, stronger, more sure of herself, more alive than the person who'd stepped out of Jake's stagecoach just weeks before. "Ezekiel Harmon," she said, "I've spent my entire adult life doing what was easy, what was expected, what was safe. I'm tired of easy. I want to try difficult for a change." The decision once made seemed to transform everything about their daily existence. Victoria threw herself into learning the skills of mountain life with a determination that both impressed and worried Ezekiel. She was too eager, too desperate to prove that she could adapt. And he could see the fear driving her efforts, the fear that if she wasn't useful, wasn't perfectly suited to this life, he might change his mind about wanting her to stay. "You don't have to master everything in a week," he told her gently one morning as she struggled with the recalcitrant milk goat. The animal seemed to sense her nervousness and responded by being particularly difficult, dancing away from her attempts to position the bucket and occasionally stepping deliberately on her feet. "I need to learn," Victoria replied through gritted teeth, trying again to approach the goat from a different angle. "I can't be a burden to you, Victoria." Ezekiel's voice was firm enough to make her stop and look at him. "You're not here on trial. You don't have to earn your place." The words seemed to release something in her, and she straightened with a sigh. The goat, sensing the change in her demeanor, settled down and allowed itself to be milked without further protest. That afternoon brought an unexpected test of their new understanding. They decided to make the trip down to Old Pete's trading post together, partly for supplies, but mostly because Victoria was determined to face whatever gossip her extended stay might have generated. She wanted to meet the speculation head-on, rather than allowing it to fester in whispers. The ride down the mountain was pleasant, with Victoria proving herself a capable horsewoman despite her refined upbringing. She rode the gentle mare that Ezekiel had borrowed from a neighbor, sitting side-saddle in her traveling dress, but handling the reins with growing confidence. Their arrival at the trading post caused exactly the stir they'd expected. Conversation stopped as they dismounted, and Ezekiel could feel the weight of curious stares from the handful of locals who happened to be conducting business. Pete emerged from behind his counter with an expression that managed to be both welcoming and wary. "Afternoon. Folks," Pete said, his eyes moving between them with obvious curiosity about the nature of their relationship. "What can I do for you?" "Just need some supplies, Pete," Ezekiel replied casually, as if arriving with a refined Eastern lady was an everyday occurrence. "And I thought Victoria should meet some of the neighbors." Victoria stepped forward with a smile that was both gracious and determined. "Mr. Morrison, I wanted to thank you for your concern the other day, and I thought it might be appropriate to introduce myself properly to the community, since it appears I'll be staying for an extended period." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of whispered conversation among the other patrons. Ezekiel watched Victoria handle the attention with poise that spoke to years of navigating social complexities. Though he could see the slight tension in her shoulders that betrayed her nerves. "Well now," Pete said carefully, that's quite a development. Are we talking about a permanent arrangement?" Before Ezekiel could respond, a voice from the back of the store spoke up with obvious disapproval. "Seems mighty irregular if you ask me. Lady of her station living alone with a bachelor man. Folks back east hear about that kind of carrying on. They'll think we're all heathens out here." The speaker was Hiram Walsh, a homesteader whose wife had died the previous winter, leaving him bitter and prone to harsh judgments about other people's happiness. Several other men nodded in agreement, and Ezekiel felt his jaw tighten with anger. "Nobody asked you, Hiram," Pete said mildly. But Victoria stepped forward before the situation could escalate. "Mr. Walsh, isn't it?" she said with perfect politeness. "I appreciate your concern for propriety. However, I'm a widow of 34 years, quite capable of making my own decisions about my living arrangements. And I must say I've found the moral character of this community to be exemplary, particularly Mr. Harmon's integrity and kindness." Her words were delivered with such calm authority that even Hiram seemed momentarily at a loss. But another voice picked up the thread of criticism. "That's all well and good, Mum, but what about your family back east? They can't be happy about this situation." Victoria's smile never wavered, though Ezekiel caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "My family's happiness is not my primary concern at this stage of my life. I've spent enough years prioritizing other people's comfort over my own." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with various townspeople offering their opinions, some supportive, others skeptical, a few openly hostile. Throughout it all, Victoria maintained her composure with a grace that made Ezekiel proud and protective in equal measure. It was on the ride back up the mountain that the full weight of what they were undertaking finally hit him. Victoria had been quiet since leaving the trading post, her usual chatter replaced by thoughtful silence. "Having second thoughts?" Ezekiel asked, as they paused to rest the horses at a scenic overlook. Victoria dismounted and walked to the edge of the promontory, gazing out over the valley spread below them. "I'm thinking about what we're asking of each other," she said finally. "What we're asking of ourselves." Ezekiel joined her at the overlook, following her gaze across the wilderness that had been his refuge for so many years. "It's not too late to change your mind," he said quietly. "If you wanted to go back to Boston, make your peace with Charles." "No." Victoria's voice was firm. "I'm not going back to that life. But I need you to understand what staying here means for me." She reached up and unfastened the locket she'd worn since her husband's death, holding it in her palm, as she'd done that first night when they'd shared their stories. But this time, instead of simply setting it aside, she drew back her arm and hurled it into the valley below. They watched it disappear among the rocks and pine trees, a golden glint that caught the afternoon sun before vanishing forever. "That was my past," Victoria said simply. "All of it, the obligations, the expectations, the person I was because I thought I had to be. I'm burying it here, in this place where you helped me remember who I really am." Ezekiel stared at her, stunned by the finality of the gesture. "Victoria, are you sure? Once it's gone, it's already gone," she interrupted. "It's been gone since the moment I decided to stay. The locket was just a symbol, and I don't need symbols anymore. I need reality." She turned to face him fully, and he was struck by the transformation in her expression. The careful composure was gone, replaced by something raw and honest and beautiful. "I need you," she said simply. "Not as an escape from my old life, but as the foundation of my new one. I need us, standing there on the mountainside, with the wind in their hair and the vast wilderness spread out before them." Ezekiel finally allowed himself to believe that healing might be possible, not just for him, but for both of them together. 3 weeks after Victoria's symbolic burial of her past, their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a man whose very presence seemed to cast shadows across the sunny morning. Ezekiel was splitting wood when he heard the sound of approaching horses. 2 riders this time, moving with the purposeful pace of men on official business. The first rider was a stranger, a well-dressed man in his 40s, with the hard eyes and careful posture of someone accustomed to enforcing other people's will. He wore a badge pinned to his vest, a private detective's shield that gleamed in the morning sun like a threat. The second rider was Jake, the stagecoach driver, whose uncomfortable expression suggested he'd been handsomely paid to guide the detective to Ezekiel's remote cabin. "Mr. Harmon." The detective dismounted with practiced efficiency, his hand resting casually on the butt of the pistol at his hip. "Detective Marcus Thornfield, representing the Ashford family of Boston. I believe you have something that belongs to them." Ezekiel set down his axe slowly, every instinct honed by years of war, telling him that this man represented serious danger. "I'm not sure what you mean, Detective. If this is about the wallet—" "The wallet was just the beginning," Thornfield interrupted. "I'm here for Mrs. Victoria Ashford, who has been unlawfully detained at this location for over a month. Her family has become quite concerned about her welfare." "Unlawfully detained?" Victoria's voice came from the cabin doorway, sharp with indignation. She stepped into the clearing, her chin raised in the gesture Ezekiel had come to recognize as her preparation for battle. "Detective Thornfield, I presume? My brother Charles always did prefer to send others to do his unpleasant work." Thornfield touched his hat with mock courtesy. "Mrs. Ashford, your family has been quite worried about you. Your extended absence, combined with reports of your unconventional living arrangements, has caused considerable distress." "My living arrangements are my own concern," Victoria replied firmly. "I'm a grown woman, free to make my own choices about where and how I live." But that's where you're mistaken, Mom." Thornfield reached into his coat and withdrew a sheaf of official-looking documents. "I have here a declaration from your family physician, Dr. Samuel Morrison, attesting to your fragile mental state following your husband's death. In his professional opinion, you are not currently competent to make decisions regarding your welfare or your finances." The words hit the clearing like a thunderclap. Victoria went pale, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "That's absurd. Dr. Morrison hasn't examined me in over 6 months, and I was perfectly well when I left Boston." "Nevertheless," Thornfield continued relentlessly, "the declaration has been filed with the appropriate authorities. Your brother, as your nearest male relative, has been granted temporary guardianship over your person and your estate. I'm here to escort you back to Boston, where you'll receive the care and supervision you clearly need." Ezekiel stepped forward, his own anger rising at the casual cruelty of the legal maneuvering. "She doesn't need supervision. She's been taking care of herself just fine up here." Thornfield's gaze shifted to him with barely concealed contempt. "And you, Mr. Harmon, are facing some serious legal difficulties of your own. Kidnapping, unlawful restraint, taking advantage of a mentally incompetent woman. These are federal crimes, especially when they involve interstate transportation." "I never kidnapped anyone," Ezekiel said evenly. "Victoria came here of her own free will, and she stayed by her own choice. The choice of a woman declared mentally incompetent by a licensed physician," Thornfield countered. "Which means any consent she might have given is legally meaningless. In the eyes of the law, you've been holding a helpless woman against her family's wishes for over a month." Victoria stepped between them, her voice shaking with rage. "This is outrageous. Charles has no right—" "Charles has every right," Thornfield interrupted, "as does your late husband's estate, which has some serious financial obligations that require immediate attention." He pulled out another document, this one bearing official seals and ribbons. "It seems your husband left some rather substantial debts that weren't discovered until after his death. The estate owes nearly $50,000 to various creditors, and your inheritance is the only asset available to satisfy those obligations." The number hit Victoria like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her face draining of color as the full implications became clear. 50,000! That's impossible. Howard was always careful with money. "Apparently not careful enough," Thornfield said, with false sympathy. "There were some unfortunate investments, some gambling debts that were concealed during his lifetime. The family's reputation depends on these obligations being met promptly, which requires access to your inheritance." "And if she doesn't return willingly?" Ezekiel asked, though he dreaded the answer. Thornfield's smile was cold as winter wind. "Then I have a federal warrant for your arrest, Mr. Harmon, and authorization to take Mrs. Ashford into protective custody. Either way, she's coming back to Boston with me." The silence that followed was heavy with despair. Ezekiel could see Victoria's mind racing, calculating options, and finding none that didn't end in disaster. The legal trap her family had constructed was elegant in its simplicity. They'd made it impossible for her to choose her own path without destroying the man she'd come to love. "There is one alternative," Thornfield said casually, as if the thought had just occurred to him. "A compromise that might satisfy everyone's interests." Victoria looked up sharply. "What kind of compromise?" "Return to Boston voluntarily. Submit to a proper medical examination by Dr. Morrison and his colleagues. If they determine that you've recovered your mental stability, say, after 6 months of proper treatment and supervision, then you'll be free to make your own decisions about your future." The offer hung in the air between them, poisonous in its reasonableness. 6 months was a lifetime, long enough for Charles to consolidate his control over her inheritance, long enough for the family to arrange another suitable marriage, long enough to ensure that her brief rebellion was thoroughly crushed. "And if I refuse?" Victoria asked quietly. "Then Mr. Harmon goes to federal prison, probably for several years. And you return to Boston anyway, but as an incompetent ward rather than a voluntary patient. The medical treatment would be less comfortable under those circumstances." Ezekiel felt something break inside his chest as he watched Victoria wrestle with the impossible choice. He could see her calculating the costs, weighing his freedom against her own, trying to find some option that didn't require either of them to sacrifice everything for the other. "Victoria," he said quietly. "You don't have to—" "Yes, I do," she interrupted, her voice heavy with resignation. "I do have to choose." She looked at him with eyes that held love and regret in equal measure. "I can't let you go to prison because of me. I can't let you pay that price for my rebellion. And I can't let you sacrifice yourself to protect me," Ezekiel replied. There has to be another way. But even as he said it, he knew there wasn't. Charles Ashford had played his cards perfectly, using the law and social convention to construct a cage that seemed impossible to escape. The only question was, who would be destroyed in the process? "I need time to think," Victoria said finally. "To pack my things and to say goodbye." Thornfield consulted a pocket watch with theatrical precision. "I can give you until tomorrow morning, Mrs. Ashford, but no longer. I have a schedule to keep, and your family is expecting your prompt return." As the detective and Jake rode away to make camp at Old Pete's trading post, Ezekiel and Victoria stood in the clearing that had been the site of their happiness, now feeling more like a graveyard for dreams they'd barely had time to dream. "There has to be something we can do," Ezekiel said desperately. "Some way to fight this." Victoria shook her head sadly. "Charles holds all the cards, and he knows it. He's spent months preparing this trap, making sure every legal avenue is blocked." She took his hand, intertwining their fingers with desperate tenderness. "But we have tonight, Ezekiel. Whatever happens tomorrow, we have tonight." That final night passed with agonizing slowness, each moment weighted with the knowledge that it might be their last together. They sat by the fire, holding each other close, trying to memorize the feeling of being complete. Victoria wept silently against Ezekiel's shoulder, her tears dampening his shirt as they both grappled with the cruel irony of finding love only to have it torn away by forces beyond their control. "I won't forget," Victoria whispered as dawn approached. "No matter what they do to me, no matter how they try to convince me that this was all a delusion brought on by grief, I won't forget what we found here." Ezekiel held her tighter, breathing in the scent of lavender that had become so precious to him. "And I won't give up. I'll find a way to come for you, Victoria. Somehow I'll find a way." But even as he made the promise, they both knew how hollow it was. What could a mountain hermit do against the combined power of Boston society and the legal system? What chance did their love have against $50,000 in debt and a family determined to maintain their reputation? When Detective Thornfield arrived the next morning, punctual as death, Victoria was ready. She'd packed her few belongings into the same traveling bag she'd arrived with, leaving behind the simple clothes she'd worn for her mountain life. She was dressed once again as a proper Boston widow, her hair pinned severely and her face composed into the mask of resignation she'd worn for so many years. "Mrs. Ashford," Thornfield said with false courtesy, "I trust you've made your decision." "I have," Victoria replied, her voice steady despite the tears that had dried on her cheeks. "I'll return to Boston voluntarily, on the condition that no charges are filed against Mr. Harmon." "A wise choice," Thornfield said, though his eyes held no warmth. "Your family will be relieved to have you back where you belong." The journey back to civilization was a nightmare of dust and regret. Victoria sat in the stagecoach Jake had brought up from the valley, staring out at the mountains that disappeared behind them with each mile. Ezekiel rode alongside for as far as the main road, where Thornfield's authority would transfer Victoria to a larger coach bound for the railroad. When the moment of final parting came, they were allowed only a brief formal goodbye under Thornfield's watchful eye. No passionate embrace, no desperate words of love, just the touch of hands and the meeting of eyes that held everything they couldn't say. "Remember," Ezekiel whispered as he helped her into the larger coach. "You're stronger than you know." "Remember," Victoria whispered back, "that some things are worth fighting for." Then she was gone, disappearing into the distance in a cloud of dust, leaving Ezekiel standing alone on the road with his heart torn out of his chest. The weeks that followed were the darkest of Ezekiel's life, worse even than the aftermath of the war. At least then he'd had the comfort of believing he deserved his suffering. Now the agony was pure and undeserved, made worse by the knowledge that somewhere far away, Victoria was enduring her own private hell. Old Pete tried to draw him out of his despair, making excuses to visit the cabin more frequently than necessary and staying longer than his business required. But Ezekiel was beyond comfort, lost in a depression that seemed to deepen with each passing day. "You can't give up," Pete said one afternoon, finding Ezekiel sitting on his porch staring at nothing. "That woman loved you. And love like that doesn't just disappear because some fancy detective says it has to." "It doesn't matter," Ezekiel replied dully. "She's back in their world now, and I have no power there. I'm just a broken-down soldier living in the mountains. What can I do against people like the Ashfords?" "Maybe more than you think," Pete said cryptically. But he wouldn't elaborate despite Ezekiel's questions. It was 6 weeks after Victoria's departure that the first letter arrived, carried by the same nervous young rider who delivered Charles Ashford's ultimatum months earlier. But this letter bore different handwriting, Victoria's elegant script. Though shaky, as if written in haste or distress, the letter was brief and carefully worded, clearly written with the knowledge that it might be intercepted and read by hostile eyes. "My dear friend, I hope this finds you well. My health continues to improve under Dr. Morrison's care, though I confess the treatment is sometimes difficult to endure. I think often of our conversations about literature and philosophy, and I find great comfort in the memory of our discussions about integrity and the courage to make difficult choices. I hope you are finding similar comfort in your books and your work. Please give my regards to our mutual friend at the Trading Post. With great affection, V.A. The message seemed innocuous enough on the surface, but Ezekiel could read the desperation between the lines. The reference to difficult treatment made his blood run cold, and the careful phrasing suggested that Victoria was being watched closely. Her correspondence monitored and controlled. More letters followed over the next month, each one a masterpiece of coded communication that spoke to Victoria's intelligence and determination. Through seemingly casual references to books and philosophical concepts, she managed to convey the reality of her situation, confined to the family mansion under constant medical supervision, subjected to daily examinations and treatments designed to convince her that her time in Wyoming had been a delusion brought on by grief and hysteria. But she also conveyed something else: hope. Buried in her careful prose were references to legal research she was conducting, conversations she was having with sympathetic friends, plans she was making for regaining her freedom. Victoria Ashford might be trapped, but she was far from defeated. The breakthrough came in a letter that arrived on a cold morning in October, nearly 4 months after Victoria's forced departure. My dear friend, I have been reading extensively about property law and inheritance rights, subjects I never thought would interest me, but which have proven quite fascinating. I was particularly intrigued to learn about the rights of married women under the new statutes and the protections afforded to property held in certain types of trust arrangements. I've also been corresponding with my late husband's attorney, Mr. Whitman, who has made some interesting discoveries about certain business dealings that were not properly disclosed during the reading of the will. It seems there may have been some irregularities in the financial records that would affect the validity of the debt claims against the estate. I thought you might find these legal developments as interesting as I do. With hope for the future, V.A., Ezekiel read the letter 3 times before the full implications sank in. Victoria had found something, some legal weakness in her brother's case, some flaw in the financial obligations that had been used to justify her imprisonment. She was fighting back, using her intelligence and education to find a way out of the trap that had seemed so perfect. But the letter also contained another coded message, one that made Ezekiel's heart race with equal parts hope and terror. In her reference to married women and their legal protections, Victoria was telling him that marriage would change everything, that a husband's rights would supersede her brother's guardianship, that the legal framework that held her captive could be broken if she were no longer a single woman under her family's control. The next week brought a longer letter, one that laid out Victoria's discoveries in greater detail. Her late husband's business partner had been embezzling money for years, covering his theft by creating false debt records that made it appear the company owed money to fictional creditors. The $50,000 in debt that had been used to justify seizing Victoria's inheritance was largely fraudulent, created to hide the partner's crimes. More importantly, Victoria had found an attorney willing to take her case, a progressive lawyer who specialized in women's rights and who believed that the guardianship had been improperly granted. But mounting a legal challenge would take time, and time was something Victoria might not have. Her letters hinted at increasing pressure from her family to accept a new marriage arrangement, a union with a Boston businessman who would assume responsibility for both her person and her restored inheritance. The final piece of the puzzle came in a telegram that old Pete delivered personally, his weathered face grim with the weight of the message he carried. Legal challenge, successful, stop inheritance restored, stop brother's guardianship revoked, stop leaving Boston tonight, stop meet me in Denver, stop marry me, stop Victoria. Ezekiel stared at the telegram, his hands shaking as he processed the incredible news. Victoria had done it. She'd outmaneuvered her family, exposed their lies, and freed herself from their control. But more than that, she was asking him to take the ultimate step, to join his life to hers in a way that would make their bond legally unbreakable. "When's the next train to Denver?" Ezekiel asked, already moving toward the cabin to pack. Pete smiled for the first time in months. "There's one that stops in Cheyenne tomorrow afternoon. You can make the connection to Denver from there." As Ezekiel threw his few belongings into a traveling bag, his hands fell on the medal that still sat on his table where Victoria had first discovered it. He held it for a moment, remembering the man he'd been when he'd earned it. Brave, decisive, willing to risk everything for what mattered. That man had been buried under years of guilt and isolation, but perhaps it was time for him to rise again. Victoria had fought her way back to freedom, had risked everything to reclaim her right to choose her own destiny. The least he could do was meet her courage with his own. He pinned the medal to his coat, picked up his bag, and walked out of the cabin that had been his refuge for 12 years, ready to begin the most important journey of his life. The journey to Denver was a blur of rattling train cars and sleepless nights, each mile carrying Ezekiel further from his mountain sanctuary and deeper into a world he'd abandoned years ago. He sat by the window, watching the landscape change from familiar peaks to rolling plains, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror that he hadn't felt since his first battle. When the train finally pulled into Denver's Union Station, Ezekiel stepped onto the platform, feeling like a man walking into his own future. The city was larger and more bustling than he remembered, filled with the energy of westward expansion and commercial progress. But all of that faded into background noise when he saw her waiting by the station's main entrance. Victoria stood in the shadow of the great brick building, wearing a traveling dress of deep green that made her auburn hair gleam in the afternoon sunlight. She looked thinner than when he'd last seen her, the months of struggle having carved new lines around her eyes. But there was something different about her bearing, a strength and confidence that hadn't been there before. This was not the broken woman who'd been forced from his cabin, but someone who had fought her way to freedom and emerged victorious. Their eyes met across the crowded platform, and for a moment the noise and chaos of the busy station seemed to fade away. Then Victoria was running toward him, propriety abandoned in the face of 4 months of separation and fear. He caught her in his arms, lifting her off her feet as they held each other with desperate intensity. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Victoria whispered against his ear, her voice thick with emotion. "Wild horses couldn't have kept me away," Ezekiel replied, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender that had haunted his dreams for months. When they finally broke apart, Victoria's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "We don't have much time," she said urgently. "I managed to slip away from Boston, but Charles will have discovered my absence by now. He'll send people to look for me. Then we'd better make this official as quickly as possible," Ezekiel said, taking her hand. "Do you know where we can find a minister?" Victoria smiled, the first genuinely happy expression he'd seen from her since Detective Thornfield had shattered their mountain peace. "I've already made arrangements. There's a church 3 blocks from here, and the pastor has agreed to perform the ceremony this afternoon." As they walked through Denver's busy streets, Victoria told him about her months of captivity and the legal battle that had ultimately freed her. The story was one of careful planning and remarkable courage, as she'd systematically gathered evidence of her brother's financial manipulations while pretending to submit to his control. "The attorney I found was brilliant," Victoria explained as they navigated the crowded sidewalks. "He not only proved that the debt claims were fraudulent, but he also demonstrated that Charles had been skimming money from my inheritance for years. The court not only restored my full inheritance, but ordered Charles to make restitution for what he'd stolen, and the guardianship dissolved completely. Dr. Morrison's competency evaluation was ruled invalid because it was based on false information provided by Charles. I'm legally free to make my own decisions about my life and my future." They paused outside the small Methodist church where their wedding would take place. And Ezekiel felt a moment of overwhelming gratitude for the series of events that had brought them to this point. A lost wallet, a dangerous journey, months of separation and struggle, all leading to this moment when they could finally choose each other without fear or legal obstacles. "Victoria," he said, taking her hands in his, "are you sure about this? Marriage will mean giving up your independence, your inheritance, your place in Boston society. Once we're wed, there's no going back." Victoria's smile was radiant. "Ezekiel, I've spent my entire adult life being told what I should want, what I should choose, what I should become. For the first time in my life, I know exactly what I want, and I'm free to choose it." She reached up and touched the medal pinned to his coat, the same medal she discovered in his cabin months ago, now worn openly as a symbol of the courage he'd found to fight for their future. "Besides," she added with a touch of her old mischief, "I've discovered that I rather like being a scandalous woman. It suits me better than respectability ever did." Before Ezekiel could respond, a commotion in the street behind them caught their attention. A carriage had pulled up in front of the church, and from it emerged a familiar figure that made Victoria's face go pale with shock and fear. Detective Marcus Thornfield stepped onto the sidewalk, his hand resting on his pistol as his cold eyes fixed on them with grim satisfaction. "Mrs. Ashford," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the busy street. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to come with me. Your family has been quite worried about your whereabouts." Victoria stepped forward, her chin raised in the gesture Ezekiel had come to love, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had fought for and won her freedom. "Detective Thornfield, I'm afraid you're operating under outdated information. I am no longer under my brother's guardianship, and I am legally free to travel wherever I choose." Thornfield's smile was cold and confident. "Perhaps, Mrs. Ashford, but there are new developments you may not be aware of. Your brother has filed additional charges related to your theft of certain family documents and financial records. There's also the matter of the fraudulent statements you made to your attorney regarding your late husband's business dealings." The lies came so smoothly that for a moment even Ezekiel almost believed them. But Victoria's laugh was clear and unafraid, the sound of someone who had faced worse threats and emerged victorious. "How interesting," she said. "And I suppose Charles provided you with evidence of these alleged crimes?" "Sufficient evidence to warrant your detention pending investigation," Thornfield replied, reaching into his coat for what appeared to be legal documents. "I don't think so," Victoria said firmly. She reached into her own traveling bag and withdrew a thick folder of papers. "You see, Detective, I've been quite busy during my stay in Boston. I've not only cleared my name legally, but I've also gathered extensive evidence of my brother's own criminal activities." She held up the folder with triumph in her eyes. "Embezzlement, fraud, perjury, conspiracy. Charles has been quite the busy criminal. And Dr. Morrison, who provided that fraudulent competency evaluation. He's been accepting payments from Charles for years to provide medical opinions that supported the family's financial interests." Thornfield's confidence wavered slightly, but he pressed on. "Even so, Mrs. Ashford, I have my orders. Orders that are no longer valid," Ezekiel interrupted, stepping forward. His years of military service had taught him to recognize authority and to challenge it when necessary. "Detective, unless you have a current valid warrant signed by a federal judge, you have no authority to detain Mrs. Ashford." "And you are?" Thornfield demanded. "Captain Ezekiel Harmon, late of the Union Army," Ezekiel replied, letting his military bearings show for the first time in years. "Decorated veteran and soon-to-be husband of this lady. I've had some experience with legal matters in my time, and I know when someone is overstepping their authority." Victoria looked at him with surprise and admiration. This was a side of Ezekiel she'd never seen, the soldier and leader he'd been before guilt and isolation had driven him to the mountains. His presence commanded respect even from Thornfield, who clearly recognized the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Furthermore," Ezekiel continued, "any attempt to interfere with our wedding ceremony could constitute unlawful restraint. especially given that Mrs. Ashford's legal guardian status has been revoked by the courts. Thornfield's hand moved toward his weapon, but before he could draw it, another voice rang out from the church steps. "Is there some problem here, folks?" The speaker was a man in his 50s, wearing the collar of a Methodist minister, but his build and bearing suggested a background in something more physical than theology. Pastor Samuel Mackenzie had served as an army chaplain during the war, and he'd seen enough of life to recognize trouble when it appeared on his doorstep. "Pastor Mackenzie," Victoria said with obvious relief, "we're here for our wedding ceremony. This gentleman seems to think he has some legal authority to prevent it." Mackenzie looked Thornfield up and down with the measuring gaze of someone who dealt with bullies and troublemakers in army camps from Virginia to Georgia. "Son, this is Colorado territory, not Massachusetts. Whatever authority you might have had back east doesn't carry much weight here, especially when you're trying to interfere with a legal wedding ceremony." "I have federal authority," Thornfield began. "Then you'll have federal paperwork to prove it," Mackenzie interrupted. "Current paperwork, properly signed and witnessed. Do you have such documents?" Thornfield's silence was answer enough. His authority had been based on Victoria's former legal status, and with that status changed, he was just a hired thug with no legitimate power. "I thought not," Mackenzie said with satisfaction. "In that case, I suggest you remove yourself from church property before I call the local sheriff to discuss your interference with a religious ceremony." For a moment, it seemed as though Thornfield might try to force the issue. His hand remained near his weapon, and his eyes moved between Ezekiel and Victoria as if calculating the odds of successfully completing his mission through violence. But whatever he saw in Ezekiel's stance, the readiness of a trained soldier, the protective determination of a man defending the woman he loved, apparently convinced him that the risk was too great. With a curse that made Pastor Mackenzie frown disapprovingly, Thornfield turned and stalked back to his carriage. "This isn't over," he called back as he climbed into the vehicle. "The Ashford family has a long reach, Mrs. Ashford. You do well to remember that." Victoria watched the carriage disappear into Denver's afternoon traffic, then turned to Ezekiel with a smile that was both relieved and radiant. "Well then, Captain Harmon," she said, taking his arm, "shall we get married?" 1 year later, the first snow of winter was dusting the peaks around Eagle Mountain as Victoria Harmon stood in the doorway of the cabin that had become her true home. The morning sun caught the gold band on her finger, a simple ring that Ezekiel had carved from mountain stone on their wedding night in Denver, more precious to her than any jewel from Tiffany's could ever be. The cabin had changed considerably since her return as Ezekiel's wife. What had been a functional but sparse bachelor's dwelling was now a warm and welcoming home. Bright curtains framed the windows, books filled additional shelves, and the scent of fresh bread often mingled with the pine smoke from the fireplace. But the most significant change was visible in the corner where a handcrafted cradle rocked gently. Occupied by a sleeping infant with her father's dark hair and her mother's intelligent eyes, little Sarah Harmon, named for the woman Ezekiel had loved and lost so long ago, with her blessing given in a letter that had finally found peace with the past, was 3 months old and already the center of her parents' universe. Victoria watched her daughter sleep, marveling at how completely her life had been transformed by that simple act of kindness that had brought a lost wallet back to its owner. "She's going to be spoiled rotten," Ezekiel said softly, coming up behind his wife and wrapping his arms around her waist. "Old Pete was up here again yesterday with another toy he'd whittled for her." Victoria leaned back against her husband's solid warmth, still sometimes amazed by the simple pleasure of having someone to share these quiet moments with. "He's making up for lost time. I think he'd given up hope of ever having children to spoil around here." The transformation in Ezekiel over the past year had been as remarkable as her own. The haunted isolation that had defined him for so long had gradually given way to contentment and purpose. He still had difficult days when the memories of war seemed particularly heavy, but Victoria's presence and love had helped him learn to carry those burdens without being crushed by them. Their marriage had scandalized Boston society exactly as expected, but Victoria found she cared remarkably little about the opinions of people whose approval had once seemed so important. Charles had made several attempts to challenge the marriage and reclaim control over her inheritance, but each legal maneuver had been firmly rebuffed by the Colorado courts and Victoria's formidable attorney. The inheritance itself had proven to be substantially larger than anyone had realized once Charles's embezzlement was fully uncovered and prosecuted. Victoria now controlled a fortune that would have made her one of Boston's wealthiest widows. But she'd chosen to use that wealth in ways that would have horrified her former social circle. Much of the money had gone toward establishing a fund for war veterans struggling with the invisible wounds that had once driven Ezekiel to isolation. The Harmon Foundation, as it had come to be known, provided both financial support and practical assistance to men trying to rebuild their lives after service. It was work that gave both Victoria and Ezekiel deep satisfaction, turning their personal healing into something that could benefit others. A portion of the inheritance had also been used to improve life in their adopted mountain community. The one-room schoolhouse that served the scattered homesteads now had proper books and supplies, and Old Pete's trading post had been expanded to include a small lending library that Victoria maintained with passionate dedication. "Mrs. Harmon," came a familiar voice from outside. "You decent in there?" Victoria smiled at Old Pete's careful announcement. Despite being invited repeatedly to simply walk in, the old trader maintained strict propriety when visiting, especially since the baby's arrival. "Come in, Pete," Ezekiel called. "Coffee's fresh." Pete entered with his usual cargo of news, gossip, and small gifts, his weathered face lighting up at the sight of the sleeping baby. "How's our little princess today?" "Growing too fast," Victoria replied, accepting his kiss on her cheek with the affection she'd come to feel for the man who'd become like a father to both of them. She smiled at Ezekiel this morning, a real smile, not just gas. "Course she did," Pete said with satisfaction. "Smart as her mama, that one's going to be." As Pete settled into his chair with a cup of coffee, he pulled out a letter that made Victoria's heart skip. The Boston postmark and expensive paper could only mean one thing: communication from her former world. "This came through yesterday," Pete said, handing over the envelope. "Looks official." Victoria opened it carefully, her face showing surprise as she read. "It's from my youngest sister, Margaret. She's asking if she can come for a visit." The letter was longer than any communication Victoria had received from her family since her marriage, and its tone was markedly different from the angry denunciations that had followed her wedding. Margaret wrote about feeling suffocated by Boston society, about watching Victoria's courage from afar and wondering if she might find her own path to happiness. "She says Charles is furious about her even writing to me," Victoria continued. "But she doesn't care anymore. She wants to see what I've built here, wants to understand how I found the strength to choose my own life." Ezekiel read over her shoulder, then looked at his wife with gentle eyes. "What do you think?" Victoria gazed out the window at the mountains that had given her sanctuary and strength, then down at her sleeping daughter, who would grow up knowing that women could choose their own destinies. The answer came without hesitation. "I think the mountains have room for one more refugee from respectability," she said with a smile that held all the warmth and wisdom she'd gained in her journey from Boston. Widow to mountain wife and mother, as if sensing the moment's significance, baby Sarah opened her eyes and looked up at her parents with the solemn gaze of someone who would grow up knowing that love could triumph over convention, that kindness could change lives, and that sometimes the most important journeys began with the simple decision to do what was right. Outside, the snow continued to fall gently on the cabin where a lost wallet had led to found love, covering the mountain trails with the same white blanket that had hidden treasure in the form of a leather billfold so many months ago. In the warm kitchen, 3 generations, Pete, Victoria and Ezekiel and baby Sarah, sat together in comfortable silence, living proof that families could be chosen as well as born. and that home was wherever love decided to put down roots.